Today's episode, number 31 of Ice Ice Beta, will help us transition from our summer focus on dry tooling towards the upcoming winter season. That's because we're joined by Doug Heinrich, who has just about done it all and seen it all in ice climbing as both a climber and product designer. Doug hails from Salt Lake City, where he began climbing in the 1970s. He was an extensive route developer, including many mixed climbs in the Wasatch, competed at the X Games, and has been at the vanguard for product at Black Diamond almost from the beginning. In this episode, we chat about the climbing scene in Utah, from early bouldering to the evolution of ice climbing to the advent of sport climbing and sport mixed climbing, lessons learned from Mugs Stump, the importance of humility, the evolution of Black Diamond and what most people don't understand about the company, and lastly, how passion projects lead to innovation and why he's excited about his new venture, Aniiu. Personally, what I found particularly compelling is the fulfillment Doug derives from contributing to the climbing community, and I think that'll come across to you as well. By this point, you know the drill. We'll get to all of that and more right after a quick message from our sponsors.
We get it. For us, ice season never really ends. It just kind of blends between rock, plastic, and plywood until waterfalls freeze again. No matter how you climb in the off-season, Furnace Industries keeps you going till your next bout of screaming barfies. With their gym-safe dry ice evolutions, you can keep up your fitness indoors. And if you're looking to challenge yourself on your home wall, they have the largest variety of dry tooling holds in America. Check out their full lineup of ice and dry tooling gear at furnace-industries.com. Because for us, it's always ice season.
Hi, it's Katie McKinstry Stylos. And when it comes to winter climbing, having the right gloves can make or break your day on the ice. With Aniiu, you're in good hands. A small boutique brand founded by passionate climbers for climbers. The mission is simple: to create the best ice climbing and dry tooling gloves that are durable, dexterous, and waterproof. Personally, I can't imagine climbing any day on tools without my Aniiu gloves. Whether I'm on a steep pitch and highlight climbing in my Vincent lights, belaying in the bingo cave with my Vincent mitts, or climbing at my limit in the Dolomites of Italy. They're my reliable partner in the cold and on tools. Experience the difference with Aniiu. Check them out at aniiu.com.
You started climbing and ice climbing in the 70s in Utah, and during that time there were folks like Mugs Stumps and Jeff Flo and Conrad Anker around, and I mean, really fascinating period of climbing history, especially for ice climbing. But just to kick things off, how did you get into the sport, and then what was the scene like back then?
Let's see. So I was fortunate that my family had a place up at Flaming Gorge, which is a reservoir, it's basically the Green River that's dammed, and it's right on the edge of Wyoming. Half the lake's in Wyoming and half of it's in Utah. And we just spent a lot of time on the lake when I was a kid. And I met this family, and the guy, his name was Bud Packham, and he had climbed in the Tetons in the 50s, which is super rare. And I was like kind of fascinated by it because I was already somewhat enthralled with the mountains. And, kids at that time like to go hiking. It just like the thought of hiking kind of sucked, so why the hell would you go hiking? But
sure,
you get kind of introduced to that through Boy Scouts. And so we had done Kings Peak, which is the highest peak in Utah, when I was 11 on this Boy Scouts outing. And I thought it was pretty cool. It's like 13,000 feet and it was an overnight thing. And I hadn't really done anything like that. And then I met this guy, Bud Packham, and his son, David. David and I became friends. And the next summer, it was unfortunate that David couldn't go, but his brother Scott, who was older, who was like kind of a rock star kind of guy, he was like really skinny and played the bass. And I thought he was like super cool. But Scott and I ended up going to the Tetons with this group of people. And I took like an Amtrak train to, Pocatello at 12 years old. And then David picked me up in their farm truck. And then I went to the Tetons with Scott. And it was like this super random thing. We didn't know anything. And we had like a piece of 1-inch webbing that we tied around our waist. And we went with these, I don't know if it was a church group or what it was, but we were just this small group of people. And Scott and I just somehow got up the Grand Teton and rappelled off. And it was like a bizarre experience, but that's what sparked me to be in the mountains and climbing. I thought it was super cool. And of course, we had these big leather boots and we got blisters, of course. And it was just like this life-changing experience.
Did you end up picking up the bass?
No, I play guitar. So,
Uh,
and I had started guitar around 12, and we were really into like Black Sabbath and, kind of the heavy metal for that time scene. And I still am, I still love playing an electric guitar and, the Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin era. Yeah, that music had kind of a big influence on me.
Did that music stay with you during climbing too? Because I know that, like the anthem of Alex Lowe was punk and thrasher stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Conrad is really into music, and Mugs was kind of into like Indian music,
Oh, okay.
kind of world music. And I was always pretty steadfast on being into hard rock, basically, Zeppelin, Sabbath type stuff.
So you were hooked on climbing, and you basically been climbing ever since, and got really into it the first few decades. But what was the scene like in Utah at that time?
So yeah, you had mentioned Conrad. So Conrad hit the scene here probably about around 82 or 83. So Conrad's dad, and I could have this wrong, but it's probably 99% accurate. He basically worked for the federal government and he'd loaned foreign countries money. So
Okay.
like international banking. And so Conrad lived all over the world. Like he may have been living in Germany at that time, and Conrad speaks German fluently, even though he won't tell you that he does. He probably speaks Spanish too, but Conrad showed up here for college. So it was sort of sans Conrad during that era. But really, Mugs Stump was around and he traveled a lot internationally. We had a really small kind of core climbing scene here. Brett and Stuart Ruckman had written the guidebooks. This guy, Brian Smoot, had helped write a guidebook with Les Ellison. And this guy, Merrill Bitter, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, he was kind of like the god of rock climbing. And honestly, there were like no women climbing then. There were a couple women, but few and far between. Like Rick Wyatt was pretty heavy duty into the scene, and his wife, Evelyn Lees. A few women, but it was predominantly just a bunch of dudes. And the scene was really tight and small. And surprisingly, there was a lot of bouldering happening back then. This guy named Dave Reed, he was almost like Native American looking guy. He was super into bouldering. So at a really young age, I bouldered a lot with Dave Reed. And, the grades don't really matter. We were probably bouldering V1, V2, V3 up in Little Cottonwood. And it was super awesome. Like Merrill, he was quite the endurance guy. And so he had these like long traverse things that we would try as kids and, eventually master them. But that was kind of cool that bouldering was such a big part, which was great for me because I honestly didn't have much gear. So it was much easier for me to boulder. And, thinking back, the shoes were so bad, like so painful, like the EBs. The rubber sucked. They were wicked uncomfortable, but that's all we had, right? So, it was a pretty tight scene. And obviously, sport climbing didn't exist then. It was all traditional, ground up, a lot of hard slab climbing, like really hard slab climbing. Like even some of those routes are fairly terrifying today, even with people's skills, like really dangerous. Like you could flip over and hit your head, and 1/4-inch bolts that were drilled by hand. And yeah, it was like kind of like super adventure climbing. No one was wearing a helmet. Like I think maybe some ice climbers wore helmets back then, like the Joe Brown helmet that was like super heavy, almost like a motorcycle type helmet. But yeah, it was kind of like a iconic group of kind of misfits, I guess. Unusual people. Just different, engineers and dirtbags and lawyers and doctors, just kind of a bizarre, eclectic group of people.
Do you think, because I know that LDS has a really strong presence in Utah, especially Salt Lake area.
Absolutely.
Do you think that influenced the number of women that were like open to the idea of climbing at that time? Or do you think it was more like something else going on?
That's a really good question. I don't know if the Mormon church had anything to do with women climbing. I just think women are generally smarter than men. And so they're probably just like, this is stupid and dangerous. Why would you go do that? And so.
Why would you climb the Grand Teton with 1-inch webbing?
Yeah, exactly. So it's weird because I'm working on this Stairway to Heaven documentary and I'm trying to get as much of a female voice in there at all. But I mean, a lot of the main question is sort of why were there so few women ice climbers or climbers in general, which I don't really know the answer to that, to be honest.
I didn't realize you were working on a documentary. So what is this? What's this project?
The documentary is I really wanted, when Merrill Bitter passed away, I realized that I really wanted to get the stories down about the first ascent of Stairway to Heaven, which Jim Knight, was part of the first ascent party. And Jim and I worked together at Black Diamond. He was the creative director in marketing and super great guy, like unbelievable athlete. He's done a ton of ultra running and a lot of first ascents and just has a really good sense of style. So I really wanted to get Jim's story down as well as Brian Smoot. And then, there's a lot of layers to it. Some of it actually really hits the sort of Mormon church and people, that didn't quite fit into the Mormon society, really finding their community and climbing and the bonds that it makes and the friendships, especially when they felt somewhat like outcasts in the Mormon church, because they just didn't fit in. So there's a bit of a focus on that. And it's not really like Mormon church bashing at all. It's just like it doesn't work for everyone. And climbing is a pretty strong sense of community. So that's the gist of the documentary, is that a chronological kind of history of the climbing on that route, because it's arguably the largest ice climbing in the lower 48, because it's around 12 to 1,500 feet high with all the mixed lines. And so there's really nothing. It's Canadian level, actually bigger than a lot of the Canadian routes. And it's in our backyard. So it's just interesting. And the way the crow flies, it's about probably less than 5 miles to the epicenter of the Mormon church in Provo. So it's just really interesting. And it's also called Stairway to Heaven. So
yeah, what's the story behind the name?
Well, I think Jim told me, I've got it recorded. I think that, it's a stepped route. And I think when they did it, it just kind of made sense. And obviously,
sure,
the famous Led Zeppelin song at the same time. So kind of that double meaning. I mean, you have the church's version of your Stairway to Heaven. You've got the psychedelic rock era of Stairway to Heaven. And then you have the physical route itself, which is stepped, and it's a pretty large route. So you kind of do feel like you're climbing a Stairway to Heaven.
I mean, lucky to have that in your backyard. And
yeah, so lucky.
You had some funny descriptions actually in other interviews where you were like, we were a bunch of hillbillies. I don't know if you want to redact that, but you were like, we're a bit of a backwaters. But you also had very international climbers like Mugs Stump as your mentor. And then you were doing a lot of climbing around the country too, Yosemite and Zion and places like that. And with that context and the special type of climbing that you do have access to, would you say there were any particular like quirks or styles or ethics of the climbing scene when you were coming up at that time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, very traditional ethics, right? Like Mugs had very strong traditional ethics, although he embraced sport climbing when it started to happen, probably more than a lot of people, just because it's just a different type of climbing for him. But yeah, mainly ground up. There was, maybe a few protection bolts were put in on rappel, like Brett or Stuart would know more than me, but I don't think anyone had even really thought about wrapping down and putting protection in. It sounds kind of silly, but it was sort of like, no, you just went up to the base and figured out a way to get up the line. And to be honest, that's why most of the focus was on natural lines or weaknesses versus really looking outside the box. I mean, I remember going to the City of the Rocks like in the 70s. And to be honest, we just climbed the cracks there. We didn't even look at the face. And obviously, 90% of the climbing in the City of the Rocks is face climbing. And we just didn't even really consider it because we were just like a bunch of crack monkeys, you know? Like we basically just, we for the most part, we sought out cracks because they were the weakness and it was just easier to protect. And
Yeah,
so
sure.
when I kind of say backwaters, I really felt like, you know, when the first World Cup happened at Snowbird, just because the Europeans seemed so much more refined in the way they moved. They were just so elegant. That's why I kind of reference us as being somewhat like hillbillies, because we were, I don't know, just kind of these strong crack monkeys that were just cruising around, and we just didn't really have that sense of style.
You weren't wearing Lycra.
Not then. No, painter pants. Yeah, definitely the white painter pants were they were the rage.
Well, that was a pivotal moment for the U.S. because I think that was the first World Cup, right? And
Yep.
Jeff Lowe put it together.
Absolutely. And that, you know, I think that just changed all of our point of view on, from an aesthetic or style perspective, we just were opened up to a whole new way of movement that we'd never seen before. At least I never had, and most of my friends, you know, because we just didn't, you know, none of us really had the means to climb in Europe. Certainly Mugs did, but he was guiding and he was also, you know, climbing alpine routes, not necessarily going over there sport climbing.
Did you see a direct influence on development in climbing in Utah after that event?
Absolutely. You know, Boone Speed and Bill Boyle and Jeff, and there were others as well, but that was the main trio, Jeff Pedersen, that were, you know, developing American Fork. But I think having the Europeans here and they climbed a lot of the local routes, you know, maybe those guys, that group of people, Marc Leministrel and DDA and, you know, Gilbert Trudeau, a lot of the Patrick Elanger and Isabelle Patissier and Catherine Destavel, you know, that kind of, there's others, but, you know, Lynn Hill obviously was exposed to international climbing, but just seeing them climb and watch them on site, you know, the hardest routes that we had put up, just, it kind of basically opened our eyes to what the possibility of climbing was. And no one ever said American Fork was a great destination. It just was close to home. It was limestone and it was really steep and really hard climbing. And so I think American Fork changed climbing in Utah significantly just because it opened up the harder grade of climbing, especially face climbing and really steep overhung stuff. I mean, you know, we had things like Fallen Arches, which Steve Hong put up, which is a 513 crack, but again, we were really focused on crack climbing, and Little Cottonwood didn't lend it. There's just not many steep routes in Little Cottonwood. It's more of like a vertical at best, a slab, and Fallen Arches maybe the steepest route in Little Cottonwood. I mean, I can't think of anything steeper because it's sort of double overhung. So that's why it's 13A, not, you know, 512.
Because you were, I mean, by circumstance, I guess, an early adopter of bouldering in the area. And then were you also quick to sport climbing as well?
Yeah, you know, I'm like one of these guys that I just like climbing, and I really always tried to learn different types of climbing. Like, you know, I'm not very good at off-width climbing. I sort of avoid it, but I know how to do it. I was really bad at aid climbing, but I figured out how to do it and got pretty proficient to the point, you know, where I climbed A5 routes or, you know, put up aid routes. But, you know, for me, it was just, I kind of liked all aspects of climbing. So I always sort of liked learning new styles of climbing, whether it's crack climbing, slab climbing. And we all grew up slab climbing. So we were actually pretty damn good slab climbers. But, you know, when it came to overhanging limestone or sandstone climbing, and we just got our asses handed to us. You know, like I vividly remember going to a place like Red Rocks, and Mike Tupper had put up a lot of the steeper rock routes, and then there was sort of a Salt Lake contingent, and you know, those routes it was a total change, or even like American Fork, but we adapted pretty quickly to it. I think the interesting thing is, and I think about it today when I go to the rock gym, I mean, most of the people I know that started sport climbing during that era were somewhere between like 25 and 30 years old, and they all had jobs and climbing was their passion, but they all climbed up to like 13A or 14A. And so by today's standards, like kids with gyms and coaches and stuff, they should be climbing, you know, 14C at a minimum, right? Because the world has changed so much. Like double digit boulders, 14C should be kind of the average these days just because of what's available to kids. It's really interesting. And, a lot of this stuff you were just learning on the fly, right? Like, and there was no such thing as a coach. You just watched better climbers and emulated it.
It is interesting, right? Because like the average difficulty of grade is probably higher.
It's got to be, right?
But at the same time, people are not all around climbers and climbing very strong in all these different disciplines, like the climbers of your generation were. And so there is like this sort of fundamental shift. There's a lot more, I think, specialists these days.
Yeah, totally agree.
And I guess I wonder, we talked a little bit about Stairway to Heaven, and I kind of want to go more towards like ice climbing and mixed climbing. And I'm curious, like being an all-around climber, you could kind of show up anywhere and then just start doing the thing. And so I guess like for you, what was motivating you, or what were some of your dreamlines at that time? Like we're maybe focusing more on like ice climbing and winter climbing.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is that climbing during that era was seasonal, right? Like, so there was no such thing as winter rock climbing because Little Cottonwood, is covered in snow as a general rule. So ice climbing was the alternative. And also, if you wanted to climb mountains, alpine stuff, you had to learn how to ice climb. So, I never committed to Alaska. I mean, I've done multiple trips to Alaska, but I never was like, A, I couldn't afford it, but B, I just didn't really have that interest in like Himalayan type climbing. It just seemed too expensive and, to be honest, almost like too dangerous.
And it seems like a lot of just sitting around.
Yeah, sitting around, and I don't smoke weed, so it seems like most of those people just sit in their tents and get high while they're waiting, right, for months and whatever. It just seemed like a waste of time to me because I've always had a job. But it's really cool, and I'm sure the mountains are amazing, but I just never dedicated the time. And the Himalayan style climbing was sort of really, really limited. Like very few people were able to do that, and they were typically guiding, or there was some sponsored trip, right? Because no one had that kind of money. So I think ice cragging, I'd kind of put it in that zone. There was pretty good access here to ice cragging, and it was, in a way, like I think most of us, Mugs included, rock climbing was always the base, and ice climbing was a skill that you acquired. I know very, very few people, maybe Nate Sackett, we call him the Sack Attack. He's like really psyched on ice climbing, and he's not much of a rock climber, I don't think, but he never talks about it. But most of us were rock climbers, and then we ice climbed in the winter. And mixed climbing kind of was an evolution, right, of you got to know how to rock climb to mix climb, because the definition of mixed climbing is like rock and ice. It wasn't necessarily dry tooling. It was more like, sometimes you'd use your hands, sometimes you'd use your tools, but you were just able to link patches of ice together. And fortunately for us, like Provo Canyon is not very far away. There's a handful of really good routes, like the Fang, the Finger of Fate, postnasal drip comes in once in a while, obviously Stairway to Heaven, and then the Bridal Veil area. And then we also had Santaquin Canyon, which is a little bit further south. And Maple didn't exist in the beginning. So basically in our backyard, I mean, I remember Seth Shaw and I would always try to do all the major ice flows every season. And so, it was super fun, and they would come in differently, and not all of them would form all the time, but that was always fun to just kind of tick off every major formation that came in every winter, whether it was Malin's up in Ogden, or I didn't go down to Price much, like to the Price Sickle or Donor Sickle or whatever those routes are down there, just because it was a bit out of the way. And, I think they do form pretty consistently, but they weren't on the regular circuit. So, in a pretty small proximity, probably an hour and a half away from Salt Lake, there's quite a few ice climbs. And so I think we just really enjoyed that kind of switch. Like sounds weird. It was almost like a break from rock climbing. And then it was also, you have those skills, right? Like, especially for someone like Seth or Conrad or Muggs, who obviously focused on climbing, bigger mountains, whether it was Alaska or Himalayas or Alps, they had those skills and kept them pretty tuned. I think maybe the most days I was able to climb ice here was probably 50 days, which was a really big winter. Typically we get, 20 to 40 days of good ice climbing in here.
Oh, wow. Okay. I didn't realize it was that sort of like truncated.
Yeah. I mean, it's typically in a normal year, I'd say it's from about December 15th to March 1st is like normal year.
Oh, okay.
This last year was absolutely the worst year we've ever had that I ever remember. And the year before was the best year ever. So I guess we're back to the average now. So
El Nino, La Nina.
Yeah,
Or more.
exactly. We didn't realize it back then, but we are in a bit of an ice mecca in the Wasatch. Unfortunately, the elevation is slightly too low. A lot of the ice climbs are around 6,000 feet. Like if they were at 8,000, we would have more consistent ice. But I don't think growing up we realized that we were in such an ice mecca. I mean, would hear things about Colorado, and some of us, of course, that was probably our first venture out of the state was to go to Colorado and climb Bridalveil Falls. And then, Ouray didn't exist back then. Like Seth and I went to Ouray long before it was an ice park and climbed, up on the road above Ouray, kind of some of those standard routes. And then there was a hotel there called the Vic. I don't even know if it still exists because I haven't been there for a while, but this guy named Bill let us stay in his hotel because John Barstow at that time was shooting this climbing. It's so crazy how the world's changed, right? He had this climbing calendar called High Exposure. I think that's what it was called. And John Barstow did it for years. And he would, shoot photos of us, and specifically Seth ice climbing, because Seth was a, maestro of ice climbing. And we would go climbing in Ouray before it was a park, and some of the pipe had leaks in it. And so it would form a few ice routes in there. So it was kind of cool to have climbed in Ouray before it was like really Ouray, as it is today.
Another Jeff Lowe project, which is again interesting.
For sure, which is incredible because that's probably opened up ice climbing to so many people, because otherwise it's pretty trad scary, right? Like it's hard to learn how to ice climb. And that's another thing that's really cool about Stairway to Heaven is the bottom pitch, which is around 70 meters, like I'd say about a third the way up, there's a big ledge that you can walk up to. And then there's really easy access for top roping. And so a lot of people learn how to ice climb at the base of Stairway to Heaven. I don't think it's the greatest place to hang out just because there's a lot of stuff above it that people, they don't even know that. They don't even understand that there's ice up there that can fall down, rock fall, etc. But thank God there hasn't been many accidents. But, that's like stepping back, we have a really cool training ground for people to kind of get introduced into the sport. That's, it's like a 15-minute approach, and then you can set up top ropes and check out ice climbing.
How were you learning back then? Because I mean, not everyone gets to be mentored by Mugs Stumps, and not everyone gets to have a climbing partner such as Conrad. And like, I guess what was that like without having Ouray and without having TR access? Like, what was your progression like?
Yeah, I mean, like all of us during that era, it seemed like to make some side money, I did some guiding, and there was a guide service in Salt Lake called GuideWorks that was founded by Dennis Turville and Dean Hannibal. And Dean, was an alpinist. I mean, he climbed with George Lowe and did some badass stuff as well. Dean was quite a competent ice climber and alpinist. And, I climbed with Dean a bit. I think the first time I did the Great White Icicle, which is a local, it's kind of like a miniature alpine route with some, grade 3, maybe grade 4 technical water ice. And I did that, frequently with Dean. He was a great mentor. And then Conrad and Seth Shaw, Seth unfortunately passed away. And, so I was just kind of climbing with, friends that were, to be honest, they were more into ice climbing than I was. Because I couldn't afford the gear. So Muggs gave me some Koflak boots because he had sponsors. And then he gave me some Stubai tools way back when. And then, so, I think honestly, the gear was kind of it limited a lot of people because it's still expensive, but it was expensive back then. And, buying Koflak plastic boots and then crampons and ice tools and then screws, it was a pretty big investment. So I just kind of borrowed stuff and just went with my friends. That was sort of my progression. And I really wasn't even that interested in leading ice until, later on. Like I had climbed thousands and thousands of feet of ice before I really started leading anything difficult. So I had a really tons of miles underneath me before I really kind of cast out and said, I really like the sport and I'm going to invest in it and actually get the gear and start leading.
Were you ice climbing starting young too? Because you lived through an inflection point in technology for gear. I mean, around 78, 79, things really changed.
Yeah, definitely. There was a huge change in the equipment. I mean, I remember vividly when the Charlet Moser Pulsar came out, we just thought that thing was game changer, you know what I mean? And the screws got better. I mean, those snargs that you pounded in were pretty easy for the leader to put in, but it was hell for the person following because you almost had to chop them out. And then, we had Spectres and, crappy ice screws, but, Black Diamond developed really the best ice screws in the world. I remember vividly working with Hong Q and Bill and John Burka when we did the Express ice screw, and that thing was a total game changer. You could put the screws in faster, you could take them out faster. I mean, the BD screws were made downstairs, and there was a lot of evolution into making those tips sharper. And I really think that the ice screws, being able to put those things in easily, really changed the sport. And then the tools just got better over time. The Pulsar was really a big deal. And then, Black Diamond did the Black Prophet, and, we did the Cobra, which was arguably the best ice tool in the year, in the world for a long time. The Cobra was amazing. And it was carbon fiber, really damp. The picks were really good. And then, Petzl came out with the Ergo, the first leashless thing. And I adopted leashless climbing immediately because I hated leashes. I thought leashes were a total pain in the ass. And being more of a rock climber, I was super psyched on leashless climbing, immediately. My friend Dan Sanders and I and Drew Bedford, we just converted immediately. There were other friends like Belcourt, you'll have to talk to Belcourt about it because he was pretty anti-leashless for a while.
Oh, interesting.
Maybe he still is. I don't know, but
maybe he still is.
Yeah, he could be, but you'd have to talk to Bill about it. And I understand his logic. For me, leashless was the biggest change. It was such a breath of fresh air to climb leashless because you could shake out, your hands didn't get cold, you weren't cutting off your circulation. It wasn't such a pain in the ass to put screws in. You could match your tools, you could cross over. It totally, completely changed ice climbing. And I actually think it was safer because you climbed a little bit slower, you shook out a lot more. I think that sometimes with leashes, people would say, it's just too hard to put a screw in. I'm just going to punch it. I just can't deal with putting a screw in. And that was the biggest revolution in ice climbing for me. And I think for everyone else.
How else can we bust Bill's balls?
Bill's awesome, man. He's kind of an unknown guy in a way. I mean, he's contributed a lot of ice climbing, and, Bill's a really good ice climber. Like all of us, one of our big quests was the solo Stairway to Heaven, right? That was a rite of passage. And, I think all of us, Conrad, Seth, me, Rick Wyatt's allegedly the first person to solo Stairway to Heaven. But, Bill definitely, he's kind of an unknown character, but, he's soloed Polar Circus, and, he's legit, super strong, and he's a damn good ice climber. And he climbed a lot with Alex as well. But you'll have to ask him why he wasn't into leashless. The rest of us, we just went full force into it.
I already interviewed him, and I wish I knew that. I wish I would love to get that on record.
Yeah.
Well, in talking about the progression of technology and gear development, we kind of jumped ahead a few decades going into BD's screws, but maybe filling in the gaps a little bit, because with the advancements of technology, it also allowed things like more technical mixed climbing to be possible too. And I know that you did a ton of like development along those lines in Utah, and you even wrote the guidebook at one point.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
I was curious, like, how are you and your generation thinking about mixed climbing, like as the advancement of technology allowed you to do different things, and given your all around climbing technical background, I mean, you could do just a lot more. Like you could see lines and be like, oh yeah, that's possible. We have the tools, we have the technology.
The thing for me, honestly, is I felt like it was way safer. It's like big pillars kind of scare me, and I kind of want to keep climbing as long as I can. So I was never willing to really bet the ranch on. And I've climbed some really scary pillars that, to be honest, I just got away with it. Like when I put up Ricochet, that's one of the more dangerous things I've ever done. And I did Angel of Fear in really, really, I mean, it was super skinny when I did that thing, and I probably shouldn't have done it. So, and I've done the Fifth Pitches Stairway and other things when I probably shouldn't have done it. But I didn't like the risk equation, acceptance of risk with pillars. And so I think that we all morphed because we were, for our generation, relatively strong rock climbers. I mean, all my friends could climb 513, and we always equated mixed grades to rock grades. And I always felt like, maybe the grades have changed over time. And I know there's a whole D scale now, but I always felt like M8 was like 12C and M9 was 12D and M10 was 13A. We kind of put those grades on things, and we kind of had this catch-all where M7 was just like 511 and M6 was 510. So we didn't really have any accurate grading system. And so we just put bolts in and mixed climbed, and then we got onto the ice. So we were able to link up, sections of ice or do unformed climbs with mixed climbing. And that was sort of the means, right? So I don't think we were really embracing like mixed climbing itself. It just allowed us to climb up the stuff, and we just developed the skills. So it's kind of a silly way to describe it, but I always just thought it was a hell of a lot safer. Like I've climbed the mixed line on the left side of the Fifth Pitches Stairway probably more than I have the pillar, just because I don't like climbing that pillar that often, because I'm always worried about it breaking. It doesn't attach very well, especially on the right side, and it's been forming on the right side way more recently, and I just choose to do the harder line that's safer. So we all kind of morphed that way. And believe me, there was a big debate in Maple Canyon, and every single one of my friends that were giving me shit about putting bolts in broke pillars, and the bolts saved their lives. Like every single one of them,
Oh, wow.
So it's like we were climbing these kind of sketchy pillars, and I would just bring my drill and put a couple bolts behind them in case the thing broke. And sure enough, I mean, we all broke pillars. I mean, Chris Noble's got some great photos of me breaking one with, 3 bolts behind it. And it works. It pulls you away from the ice. You got to make sure your belayer's in a good place. But yeah, I think it was a pure safety thing. And then, at some point, I think you're spot on. I mean, the tools themselves really helped a lot, especially crampons. The foot fangs sucked. They were just too stiff. We had the switchblade was really stiff, but we were climbing in plastic boots back then, right? So everything was just too heavy. And then the whole idea of fruit boots, I mean, real fruit boots didn't exist, but Will, of course, he's always a trendsetter, had figured out to bolt on some crampons onto a lighter boot. And those were game changers. And that really opened up mixed climbing, in my opinion, having really light boots, because you can use your feet really differently. You can get your feet higher. You don't have these huge weights on you. And I adopted fruit boots really fast. Like I have some OG La Sportiva boots, and BD made, specific boots. All this stuff was for comps, but the ice comp scene at that time was almost more like a spectacle, right? Like there wasn't really an ice comp scene. You'd have to talk more to Will about that.
Just for context, what time frame are we talking about right now? This must be like the 90s.
That's in the 90s. So the mixed thing, at least around here, I don't know what was going on in Europe. I mean, Steve Haston came over and he had kind of adopted, mixed climbing. That was for sure in the 90s. Like, I would say it was kind of like pure ice climbing in the 80s, people climbing really dangerous pillars. Like, we've all seen pictures of Alex Lowe doing the thing when he shouldn't have been on it. And then, the mixed climbing, we'll call it sport mixed climbing revolution, kind of happened in the 90s. Comps started to happen. Gear changed immensely. The leashless thing came into play. And, the comp scene really changed the character.
You were talking about how you especially got into mixed climbing for the security and risk factors. And I'm wondering if you can tell the story of why are you taking this risk now? I'm putting that in air quotes.
Yeah. So Alex, he was an interesting dude. He was like really impatient and he was insanely strong. And this is no joke. Like, this is gospel. Alex loaded 400 pull-ups every morning. He would do 20 squared. So he literally would wake up and he'd do 1 and rest, 2 and rest, 3 and rest, up to 20 and then back down. And he did it every single morning.
Wow.
So Alex just was always pushing, always. Alex never went out for a casual day of climbing. Like, a casual day of rock climbing for him would be like the Backer Urian in Tuolumne. Like, he just was full speed always. And, he would do really crazy, risky stuff like all the time, and Mugs, I remember Mugs like kind of lecturing, saying, dude, you got to like save that. Like, you can only play those cards so many times before it catches up with you. And so, Muggs was way more calculated, and Muggs was an incredible ice climber, like super solid. But Muggs had a rule that if he was going to go to Alaska with someone, he had to climb El Cap with them first. It was typically some aid route, for rope skills and just having your shit together, and setting up a portaledge and haul bags and all that stuff. So Muggs basically went to Yosemite every spring, and he had this, I can't remember if it was a Chevy or Dodge van, and he would drive that thing out there, and then he would fly out of Oakland, whatever, to Alaska, and I'd drive his van back, or Conrad would. And his van always got like really shitty mileage. And we figured out why, because he had like, 100 pounds of pitons and all this shit like in the rear. I remember when we discovered that, we're just like, God damn, this guy's got like a whole, lifetime supply of pitons and gear and stuff in this van. But we were out there at that time, and this friend of ours, his nickname was Bucky, but Steve Bullock, Conrad, and I decided to go do Watkins. And, Watkins is like kind of not that many people do it. It's kind of a longer approach. It's roughly a 20 pitch, wall. I mean, everything's done in 10 minutes now, but I'm joking. But, when Tommy and Alex can do the nose in under 2 hours, like, it changes everyone's perspective. But so we went up to do Mount Watkins and spend one night, on this ledge, kind of just a fun outing. And the weather kind of looked shitty. And I remember when Steve and I were kind of packing up, Steve and I brought rain gear and, rain pants and rain jackets. And Conrad was lecturing us, telling us that it was banana weather. And he actually used that term. And he had just come from Patagonia. And I think he and Jay Smith had done like a first ascent on Torriegar or one of those things. And he was kind of like giving us shit for being nervous. So anyway, we went up on the route and, we're kind of swapping leads, and I led this kind of heinous, like super slippery C1 or something, but I just free climbed it because it was faster. And we got up to this ledge, and then the weather started getting shitty, and then it started to rain. and there was no protection on this ledge, and we didn't really have much. We just had our sleeping bags and rain gear, and then it's really started to rain. I mean, to the point where it was like a waterfall coming down this thing. And Conrad didn't have any rain gear, and it started getting cold, and now it's like late in the day, and Steve and I are like, we're fucking out of here. We're not going to try to spend the night here. And we debated with Conrad, and then we started rapping, and we were like 12 or 13 pitches up this thing, and it was like a freaking waterfall. You were rappelling in a waterfall, and Conrad got super hypothermic. I mean, Steve and I were literally like hooking. He would probably never admit to this story, but Steve and I were hooking up his belay device, having him go second. Like, he was like crazy cold, and we were like, okay. I mean, we were still getting wet, but we both had rain pants and rain jackets. And unfortunately, there's like 1,000 feet of scrambling to get up to the base of this thing. And we had to rappel all of that too, off of trees. And then we got down, of course it's dark. And then we stumbled back to Mugs's van, and Mugs just like ripped into Conrad, just saying, what the hell are you doing? Like, that's how you get yourself killed. Like, Yosemite is equally as dangerous as any other place on the planet. Anyway, that's my kind of silly Conrad story. And I think the lesson for all of us in that is you can never have hubris ever. And I'm not saying Conrad does. I mean, we were young and inexperienced at all, and that was just poor planning. And I think if you talk to Steve, he'd tell you the exact same story, so I'm not making it up. I think that the one thing that you learn, especially with ice climbing and mixed climbing, is you've always got to be on the conservative side if you want to keep climbing, because hubris won't get you anywhere, like, honestly. And I have one other really crazy mixed story for you, and I can't even believe this happened and that Scott survived. So Chris Harmston, he was a super smart guy. Like, he's got at least a master's in mechanical engineering, and he took over from Alex Lowe and ran our QA department at Black Diamond. And Chris was really psyched on mixed climbing, like really psyched. Like, to be honest, like, Chris was kind of some of the main fuel behind mixed climbing and bolting lines. And, we did a lot of routes together, like the Holy Ghost, which is to the right of the Angel of Fear. And, a lot of those routes in Santaquin and Provo and stuff. And we had kind of collectively bolted this full mix line to the top of the Stairway to Heaven, which basically you topped out. So there's a natural ice line that takes you up about 8 stairway pitches. Some pitches are 70 meters. Some are like 40 meters or 30. It's just the way the ledges break up. And so we had kind of pieced all these mixed variations that various people had contributed to the route. And then Scott, really, we have to give Scott credit, is the one that went up and kind of farmed. He just diverted some water at the top to form some ice at the top. And the ice at the top there wasn't much ice at the top. It formed this kind of grade 6 pillar. And so we had kind of linked it all together and done all the separate pitches. And then the conditions were perfect. And I took the day off work, and this guy, Dave Sanders, not Dan Sanders, was kind enough to belay me. And I got to lead every single mixed pitch on the Stairway to Heaven, and, kind of did the FFA. And I was super stoked about it. And then Scott Adamson, who was super strong, he decided to go up and solo it. And so Scott went up there by himself. And to be honest, I don't know if he had done some of the lower mixed pitches or he was just climbing the ice, but somewhere up there, he had slipped. Like, this is way up high, like between the 6th and 7th pitch. And for some reason, he had a Spectre on his harness. And I'm not making this up because I heard this firsthand from Scott. And he slipped and started sliding off this thing. And the Spectre on his harness stuck on something and stopped him.
Good Lord.
And so my point about hubris is, Scott would have like tumbled to his death from 1,400 feet up stairway had that Spectre not caught him. And again, Scott was an incredible climber. Like, he was the generation under me, and, he just took it to the next level. But, again, that hubris thing, you gotta be confident and bold sometimes, but don't ever let hubris get in your way, because it will definitely bite you. So anyway, that's my sage wisdom now that I'm old.
Much appreciated. But there's hubris, and then there's knowing what you're capable of, and then there can also be those moments of like miscalculation or not taking all the risk factors into play. And the reason why I'm saying this is because soloing was like a big part of the culture of the, at least the climbing group that you were a part of.
For sure.
And you were telling me that you would go out and do just a day of soloing, just up and down, up and down, up and down. And I guess what's the line between, you can talk to it personally for you, like the risk calculation of like, this is well within my limits, like I'm willing to do this, and, versus hubris. Cause I guess you're probably never pushing the boundaries when you're soloing, or when you were soloing rather. I don't know if that question makes sense.
No, I think it makes total sense, because I think Alex Honnold's the perfect answer to that, right? For me, it was like ice climbing. It was very condition oriented. What's the route like? Like I would never go solo Stairway to Heaven in really hard conditions, right? Everyone's comfort level's different. Like maybe someone would pick the hardest line or go do it when it wasn't formed right. But for me, it was always just, I knew the route. I'd done it before. I had rehearsed it, so to speak, kind of like Alex did with the free rider. But, I think that you're right. Like, I think if you feel prepared, the conditions are right, you're in really good shape, you feel like you're not even close to your limit. Ice climbing, as a general rule, is easier. I would never advise anyone to, do mixed climbing soloing, because it's just so insecure. And, obviously we've all seen The Alpinist, and that's a different level of commitment. And it's such an individual thing, but I think it's just your calculation of acceptance of risk. And I think when you have stuff really wired and you know it really well, you internally think that the risk is lower. Shit can always happen, right? And I think ice climbing, like I would always drag a rope, and I'd have some screws in case I wanted to retreat, right? I would climb the route by myself, but I could always bail if I wanted to. And of course, I've done the Great White Icicle, which is like grade 3. That's more like a fitness lap thing, because it's basically gully climbing. But, everyone has like a different skill level. And I would say, obviously, if you pay your dues and you really know the route and you know where your limit is, I think that's such a personal thing. So to your point, I think hubris is, I don't know, it's almost just like where your headspace is that day. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Like that's kind of what I mean by hubris, because I think if you feel really calm and relaxed and you feel solid and everything's flowing, I just think sometimes what I mean by hubris is when you kind of force things to happen that don't feel right.
Mm-hmm. Part of the reason why I'm asking is because you did have an accident soloing rock climbing, and
for sure,
it seems like the circumstances that day were maybe a bit of, if I may, hubris. And correct me if I'm wrong, but like I guess I'm curious, like what happened. And
yeah, I would for sure call that hubris, mainly because I was forcing something that I should have just backed off of it and down climbed, right? Like, and we've all done that. I'm sure if you talk to Peter Croft or anyone, people will retreat, right? Like if things don't feel right, or they don't, their headspace, they just don't feel good, they're whatever it is. And I think in that particular instance, Conrad and I had a plan to go to Patagonia. And for some reason we thought, well, we need to toughen up and go out and solo a bunch of pitches in any conditions. And so, we had a pretty big solo circuit, and I was soloing a route that I'd done many, many times, but it's kind of steep and it has one like really committing move on it. The rest of it, I think the last move's kind of committing too, depending on how you do it, but it's 5.9, but it's steep. And I think in that particular case, it was really cold. It was November. And, sport climbing, I think, teaches you a lot of process. Like if you're climbing in cold conditions, I mean, people will let their hands numb out and then they kind of warm back up. And there's like somewhat of a process. And I think, sport climbing didn't exist at that time, and we weren't as refined and also young and fairly bold. And I just kind of, I got up there and it was cold and my hands were kind of numb, and, there's always moisture in the air. And the thing was kind of a bit icy, and I should have just retreated, and I didn't. And I just thought, well, I can just do this move. And I actually slipped off a jug, and thank God I survived, because, I had a 35, I don't know, I've never gone up there with a tape measure, but high enough to get hurt bad and hit the ground, and then, spend a year recovering. So,
wow.
It was definitely a huge mistake. And I would call it hubris, meaning I forced something that I should have just retreated. And I certainly wasn't at the point of no return. Like, I could have down climbed and gotten out of there, but I just was kind of forcing it, saying, I'll be fine. I'll just get through this move. And like anything, I mean, we all have seen Free Solo, right? Alex doing that boulder problem, whatever, 2,500 feet off the deck. I mean, I don't know what you do in that situation. And I wasn't really quite there, but I did kind of force something that I should have figured out a way to get out of there. Right. And I paid the price. And luckily, I'm here to talk about it.
Yeah, thank goodness.
And that changed my climbing for sure. 100%. Like, my acceptance of risk after that just went way, way, way down.
And I mean, that's probably contributed to your longevity as well, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I've said a lot. I'd probably be dead. I mean, if you look at my friends, right, like the percentage of them, like Mugs is gone, Alex is gone, Seth's gone, Kevin Gein's gone, Conrad's alive, and he's had a lot of mishaps, really close calls. So statistically, there's no way I would be here, just because, you can only get away with that stuff so many times.
Switching gears a bit, but along the lines of longevity, you've had an interesting career, an actual career, mixing climbing and working. And it's also like you prioritized climbing more when you were younger, but you always had a job. And so you've had this sort of like inverted retirement trajectory where you're working more now than your 30s. And I think that's fascinating. And I'm wondering, because you obviously now you're a VP at Black Diamond, and I'm wondering, like, was that a calculated decision as you were getting into climbing?
I mean, like anything, if you want to get up a big route or you have a goal in climbing, you have to plan it out and you have to train and everything. And I just felt like while I was, young and healthy and fit and could do that, I just, I kind of prioritized and, trying to be frugal. Back then, we weren't spending a ton of money. I mean, most of our money was spent on drills and drill bits and bolts and hangers and, stuff like that. And then just the time, but we all lived, pretty frugally. I mean, it seemed like for a while there, we all had these like really cheap 2-wheel drive. None of us could afford a 4-wheel drive truck, of course, because they were like way too expensive. So we had these like 2-wheel drive trucks, like the kind of mini trucks with the camper shell and sleeping in the back. And, none of us even thought we could afford a van. Like Muggs was living the high life, having a van, Yeah, I think, I don't think I would do it in reverse. Like, I mean, I've always worked and I like working. And, my role at BD, I've kind of done a similar role for like the last decade, running the whole product engine, whether it was at Cool and Patagonia for a while and, at BD now for, God, I don't know how many years, 7 years or something like that. I've been doing the same thing. But I do think that I'm really glad that I took that time when I was younger. It'd be pretty tough. Like, I just turned 62, like trying to think that I could go be a full-time climber and do some badass stuff now. It's just not going to happen. Like, of course, I still climb and I can still do things, but you just age, there's no escaping it, right? Like, I remember hearing Danini, and Danini's like been a lifelong, badass climber. And you'd have to ask Jim this, because I mean, he's such an interesting guy and has done so much. But I think a while ago, he tried to do the nose in a day, and it was just like way too hard, as you get older, like you just forget, like it does catch up with you regardless of who you are. And so I don't think I would do that in reverse. I mean, I'm really glad I took that time to, climb as much as I can and keep the lights on with the job. But the focus was not the career. The focus was climbing. Like I was absolutely focused on climbing. And I had a lot of jobs that were climbing related, right? Like rigging for films and guiding and, doing even Black Diamond, it was all circling around climbing, like course setting, doing comps, all that kind of stuff.
You expressed interest in wanting to talk about Black Diamond earlier, and you've seen, I mean, holy shit, you were there from the beginning. You were recruited when they just spun out from Patagonia and they were based in Ventura. And then now they are the largest outdoor brand, or one of the largest outdoor brands, multinational billion-dollar company, I think.
Oh yeah.
Don't quote me on that.
You
could
right.
tell me. Crazy growth and progression. How did you meet Peter Metcalf?
The climbing world is pretty small, right? Especially at that time in the late 80s. And I met Metcalf because of managing IME. I met him at a trade show, and he had basically said, this was probably in like 88, had talked to me about Chenard equipment, and I knew the Chenard rep at the time. And just because, he was servicing our account, at IME, and we were one of the premier, mountain shops in the country. And so kind of got to know Peter. And I remember going down there the first time, and I was like, they didn't know if they were going to leave Ventura. And this might have been really literally as they were splitting off. And when I looked at Ventura, it's a cool place, but I was just like, as a climber, there's no way. And it's just too much driving, to be a climber. And so I originally just said, I don't think it's going to work. Like my gig in Salt Lake is too good. And at that point, the guys that I worked with, we started the Body Shop, which was one of the OG rock gyms in the country. That was more of a community thing than we weren't trying to make money off it. And then we had talked to Boreal about being the distributor for Boreal in the USA, because they were kind of the top rock shoe brand at that time. And they kind of shut us down, and they gave it to this guy, Steve West, which 2020 hindsight, it is what it is. They should have picked us. I'm joking, but they blew it. I like Steve West, but whatever. We were just totally endemic to the sport, and it would have been a really cool thing for us. But so I originally just told Peter, the math didn't make sense for me. But then I stayed in contact with Peter, and it was probably like 6 months later, he just said, hey, we've decided we're going to move, and we're moving to Salt Lake. And, I'd spent some time talking to him about Salt Lake, kind of the lay of the land. And at that point in Salt Lake, the cost of living was, I don't know the exact multiple, but it was like 5x less than Ventura, at least, if not 10x.
Oh, wow.
And proximity to the mountains, BD was a backcountry ski brand as well. So at that point, once Peter had decided that they were moving to Salt Lake, I moved to Ventura and took the job knowing that we were coming back. So luckily I got to spend some time in Ventura working with Peter, and was one of the, I can't remember the exact number of people that moved from Ventura to Salt Lake. Kathy would know, because she was like one of the longest standing Black Diamond employees that started with Chenard. But I think maybe 20 people moved from Ventura to Salt Lake. And, Belcourt was one of them, myself, Andrew McLean, Alex Lowe. It was a really small group of people. And then obviously we hired, quite a few new people within the first year that we were here. So yeah, it's been quite an odyssey, really, the whole Black Diamond thing. And I just have a ton of respect for Peter. Like, he's a really smart guy. He really cares about access and the environment and, the community. And that was such a big part of Black Diamond. And that's what made it so great, working there. And of course, we were a small company, and making payroll wasn't the easiest thing, especially when you're dealing with making climbing gear, because it's not high margin. But yeah, it was a really cool kind of odyssey to go through, and just the growth. As far as the growth at BD goes, I mean, climbing just continually became more accessible to people, and the sport kind of grew organically. And then I think, when the rock gym thing really started to happen, it just opened up climbing, way more to urban environments, to people that honestly didn't even know it existed. And so, gym climbing has really changed the sport. So, I mean, just as far as access, and it's much more diverse now. I mean, most gyms are 50+% female. There's a ton of more diversity in climbing, and just that whole progression of the sport, and being with BD, that like really we just have kind of embraced all the aspects of climbing, whether it's 8,000 meter peaks to, bouldering in gyms. Like, we're just a climbing company, and we love all aspects of sports. And our new president, Neil Fisk, asked me recently, why weren't you guys more involved in, kind of the 8,000 meter peak thing? And it's like, honestly, we couldn't afford it. Like, there was no way in hell. We didn't have the money to sponsor an expedition. Like, no way. I think Tommy Caldwell may have been our first paid athlete, and we tried to support Tommy from when he was really young. And I mean, he wasn't hardly making anything, being arguably the best rock climber in the world, or one of them. And we just couldn't afford to operate on the level that North Face or some of these other brands did. We just didn't have the money to support like every facet of climbing, from comps to traditional to alpinist to 8,000 meter people. So it's an interesting odyssey, but Metcalf did an amazing job creating a culture, really supporting the employees, the culture of climbing, access to climbing. And that was a really cool experience to be part of.
I mean, at the time of its inception, it had some of the best climbers in the world working for it. You said you were intimidated walking into the office, but there was a certain culture that they were developing at that time, and it was, I mean, really athlete employee led, it sounds like. And I'm wondering what it looks like today, because it's such a different beast of a company, and I'm sure bureaucracy and et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm wondering if maybe you could talk about like how things have progressed in that time, from like the early stages to what it looks like now.
Sometimes I'll hear, BD sold out, or what. I don't even know what that means, right? Because, we can employ more people.
You were really successful. Damn you.
Yeah. And also, like, we can employ people, and they have insurance programs and 401ks, and, people grow up and their lives change. And I would say in the 90s, not many people had kids. So you got to factor that in. And B, everyone was like super committed to whatever sport they were into, obviously. And we had incredible talent within the building. I mean, I was like on the B team, you had the superstars like Johnny Woodward and Alex Lowe, and they were like internationally recognized as the best. Johnny had put up some of the hardest rock climbs in the world. And, he put up a rock climb here that took like a decade to get repeated. That's probably like 14B.
Oh, wow.
So the bar was pretty high. And like Metcalf used to always say, you have to have growth, because, and I agree with Peter, but I remember being young and I'd come from more of a retail guiding background. So, I learned a lot about business from Peter, but, you have to have really good organic growth. And obviously we were matching the market growth. So the market was growing and we were growing. And Metcalf was really smart about saying, hey, like when we sell trekking poles or gloves or other equipment that are complementary to just climbing hard goods, it allows us to have, higher margin products, because I mean, the people don't want to know what the margins are on like cams or ice tools or crampons, because it's a really, really hard way to make money because the margins are so low.
Can you give us a ballpark?
It's sub 30% wholesale margins. And so by the time you pay a rep 8% commission and you give a dealer 3%, discount, and you ship the stuff, you're literally losing money. So you have to be able to offset that with like and we don't make crazy high margins on anything, but like headlamps or trekking poles or gloves or soft goods, packs are not great margins either. Maybe if you're doing zillions of recon packs at TNF, they probably make good margins, but technical backcountry ski packs or Jet Force and stuff, they're not great margins either. So Metcalf was really smart about offsetting. We had certain categories that were pullers, and climbing hard goods has always been sort of draggers, but at the end of the day we could run a profitable business. And systematically over time we just sort of extended, and that was a big part of my career, like going into headlamps, or I wasn't 100% responsible for trekking poles, but helmets, headlamps, just getting into helping fuel, the trekking pole growth. And tents are really low margins, by the way, too. So you kind of have to just offset that stuff and run a sound business. And also, as I mentioned before, like climbing was a seasonal business for a long time. It really wasn't a year-round business until the gyms really blew up, right? Like now, there's many people that just say, hey, I'm just going to go climb in the gym year round, not just winter. But that really helped stabilize the climbing business, whether it's rock shoe sales or harness sales or chalk bag sales, or, the main pieces of gear that you need for gym climbing. But early on, I mean, we had to have our winter business sort of making up for that, because rock climbing just completely shut off in the winter, and ice climbing's a really small piece of it, right? Like there's a lot of people that hike up snowy peaks and, snow walking and just general mountaineering, but technical ice climbing is a really small sport still, as many people do it, like compared. So, I mean, to get back to your original question, I mean, I think the change is somewhat natural. I mean, the biggest change for BD is when Metcalf, sold the company, because he needed to sell the company. He had original investors that he needed to pay back. And, it had been a long time, 25 plus years. Peter could tell the exact dates, but, and I think he picked the best partner he could find. And of course, when you sell it to investors, I mean, we're not owned by PE. I mean, we're still a pretty small company in the scheme of things, but the people that invested in Black Diamond, and it's a public company, they want a return on their investment. So there's absolutely more financial pressure on Black Diamond than when we were private, and it's a different kind of pressure. I mean, originally we had pressure to make our payroll and take care of our employees. Now we have pressure to not only do that, but then we have to be a good investment for the people that park their money in Claris Corp versus whatever, whatever their portfolio is. So, the dynamics changed for sure. And I think, obviously, we've been friends with Petzl for a long time. You would have to ask someone there, is it the same as it was in the 90s? I would assume they're just a bigger company. There's probably different pressures on Petzl, just like anything that grows over time. Even though they're still private, or La Sportiva, I think they're not 100% private. So, as you grow, you just need more capital, and business just gets more complicated. There's more risk. When you got $60 million worth of inventory, there's a lot more on the line, right? than it was back in the old days. Sometimes people will think it's bad. To me, it's just an evolution. It's like, it is what it is. We still make incredible climbing gear. We still invest a lot of money into, products that aren't necessarily profitable, but we believe in them, for the sport and for the community. And I think that gets lost on people. Like, it costs us a lot of money to develop a crampon or a new ice screw or a high-end harness that's low volume, or, a lot of these, products. Like, people don't realize how complicated it is. There's a lot of liability. There's money in tooling. It takes 3 years to design a lot of these things. So the R&D cost is, it's $1 million or something like that. So, I think from the outside, a lot of people don't really understand, that these markets are really small, and it's a passion thing for us and Petzl, quite honestly. And even like Blue Ice, when you talk to Bill, I mean, that's a passion thing for Blue Ice.
Yeah. Yeah, I was curious about that as well, because being part of the early stages of Black Diamond, like, it very much is a passion project. And you guys are like the innovators for climbing gear at that time, and backcountry skiing equipment as well. And then obviously you seem very level-headed and mindful about development of a business, because obviously like it's a very different situation now. And I guess I'm curious what motivates you to stick with it, because, you know, some people would say like, I cannot do the corporate environment. It just doesn't work for me. Like the spirit, for example, quote unquote, wouldn't be there.
Well, I would say our mission statement's the same, you know. I mean, it's to be one with the sports we serve and absolutely indistinguishable from them. That's Metcalfe's original mission statement. I think where BD got a little astray during the Walbrecht administration, and I specifically use the word administration because it's almost like a political thing, but John wanted to take the brand into a lot of different categories, and you got to be really careful with brands that you don't stretch it. You know, it's one thing to extend into headlamps because climbers use headlamps and mountaineers use headlamps and trail runners use headlamps. But when you try to move the brand into like snowboarding or whatever the hell it is, like slacklining you got to be really careful with brands. Like even Nike, you know, they've extended into categories that just didn't make sense for them, and they spent millions on it. I mean, they spent millions getting into the skate business, you know, to make skate shoes. So, you know, I would say that's probably, from a cultural perspective, the mission's the same, right? We are a climbing company. We want to create gear and support the community for all facets of climbing. I think the biggest struggle for any of the investors or the people that, you know, Warren, who's the chairman of the board, brings in is scaling Black Diamond to like a Patagonia or North Face level is really, really difficult. There's no magic formula. Like, you know, Patagonia's trajectory was really long and storied. Yvonne and Melinda could have made Patagonia a lot bigger, like earlier on, and they chose to go down the path that they were comfortable with. Obviously, because I mean, TNF and Patagonia are relatively the same age as brands, and TNF's a $3.5 billion company or $4 billion. I don't know what they are these days. I mean, they're public, but you know, the TNF path was very different than the Patagonia path, and Black Diamond's path is its own path. But people have to remember, like, we're a hard goods company. We're much more similar to Burton and Solomon than we are North Face and Patagonia. Because Yvonne decided to exit the hard goods business a long time ago, and North Face, for all intents and purposes, exited their version of the hard good business. Sure, they sell tents, but the tent business is pretty small, and, you know, they're still in packs, but, you know, they were never like a hard good business like BD is. So, you know, Solomon, Burton are probably the closer, you know, types of businesses that Black Diamond runs, and the soft good business is really hard. The only reason I'm talking about that is there's a ceiling on how many carabiners you can sell and how many ice tools you can sell and how many harnesses you can sell. And so the only way to grow is in apparel, right? Like that is it. I mean, you'll organically grow as long as you innovate and come out with great gear, but those market caps are really small. And so from a public company investor point of view, we're kind of tasked with really trying to figure out how to grow apparel. I try to be the voice of reason, saying, look, there's no way in hell we're going to be like Patagonia North Face. Like, yeah, maybe when I'm long gone, BD will be there, but there's a long road to get there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I guess the original question was sort of like what motivates you these days in Black Diamond, and we sort of did a little bit of an expository explanation of the business of Black Diamond, which is helpful to hear. But because you ended up starting a specialty ice climbing glove company, and I know that it's expanding in and of itself, but it sounds like maybe more of a passion project. And I'm curious, you know, how your interest in gloves came to be, and you know, what spurred you to start Aniiu.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I left Black Diamond, like, you know, over 6 years ago, and obviously I've been back for a year, mainly due to the administration change, but I had some bandwidth, and then, you know, the factory that I'd worked with for 25 years, you know, Black Diamond no longer decided to do business with them. And I was really close with the factory, and we just decided to do our own thing. And, we basically launched the Aniiu glove brand, which is a really tiny team. I mean, I'm 50-50 partners with the factory. So,
Oh, wow.
with Jun Takashima. So we're, equal partners. And, the beauty of that is I do have a passion for gloves because I think when it comes down to alpinism, mountaineering, ice climbing specifically, and I'm trying to do some special gloves for Katie McKinstry and some of the, D climbers because no one's really built the glove that they want. It's a really critical part of the toolkit that I think a lot of brands haven't really done a great job. During my time at BD, I mean, I remember vividly, this was like way, way back in the 90s, like all the gloves just sucked. Like they were just way too bulky. And, we were still using leashes, but I just kind of made my own gloves and I made them tight, on the palm. And, I just figured out how to make my own gloves. And then Takashima helped me make them, commercially, because sewing gloves is super hard. So, gloves are such a critical part of ice climbing, mixed climbing, etc. They're equally as critical as your tools or your crampons. And so, my little Aniiu company is just a total passion project. We have a really good sustainability story in the sense that we repurpose a lot of factory materials that Takashima has that are left over from other brands, and then we can design whatever we want. Like we have no financial pressure on us whatsoever. So we can just do whatever we want and make awesome gloves and try to, really try to come up with solutions for climbers like Katie. We want to make the perfect D glove, even though there's no market for D gloves. I mean,
Yeah, good Lord. It's going to be like a $10,000 business for a year,
that,
I think.
probably less than that. But we don't care. I just want to support her and support the sport. And I think it's fun because what those guys are doing is just an evolution of another facet of climbing. And hopefully we can come up with something that works for her. I told her the other day, I wish that Myanmar was closer because it would be easier for me to just fly to the factory and work on prototypes. It's a little bit of a back and forth with the factory being so far away. It takes us longer than we would want to get her what she needs. We've talked a lot about ice gloves within our ambassador group. And, our goal right now, we have what I would consider a pretty good all around cold weather ice glove, but there's definitely a need for a couple more models that really, as people climb harder stuff, they want thinner gloves and trying to make them warm and, not get wet and et cetera. So there's some cool technical challenges that we're working on right now for our athletes. And then there'll be a small subset of climbers that buy them, but, that's not our motivation at all. We have no employees. We have no building. We can do whatever the hell we want to. It's just a fun passion hobby project. And hey, if we end up selling a few thousand pairs of gloves a year, we'll be stoked.
Yeah. Well, first off, thank you to you for doing that, because that's where the new products seems to be coming from, is sort of the smaller brands that are up and coming.
Yeah, it's just fun, and I do think the younger generation cares, like they care. They want to support a small little brand that's not trying to take over the world. And, we're just psyched. Jun and I specifically, and Colleen, I mean, there's three of us, we're just psyched to try to meet the needs of our ambassador group and have that go out. Like Chris Davenport's one of our ambassadors, and he's a super famous skier, and he loves our gloves, and we can't pay him anything, and he's just psyched. He's psyched to support us because he loves the product that we make. And to me, that's what it's all about. And honestly, going back to the roots of BD, that's kind of where we came from.
We've come to the end, and this is the final question is, if you were to give your younger self one piece of beta, what would that be?
In closing, for me, I just feel really fortunate. I grew up here in the Wasatch Mountains, and I figured out how to make a living as a climber. I mean, I have a real job, and I've always had jobs, but I just feel really blessed and fortunate that I've been able to kind of go down my path and been able to try to impact the sport of climbing in the minor way that I have. I do think it's really important as a climber to try to contribute to the sport in your own way. Like, I always told the kids when they were growing up, people are divided into two groups. There's givers and takers, and you always want to be a giver, and you want to give back to the people around you or to what you're into. And I think that's a really important thing for me as a climber, is just to try to support the community, give back to the community, etc. in your own way. There's no prescribed way. Like, everyone can contribute in their own way.
Doug's not much for social media, but you should definitely check out his side project, Aniiu, which are focused on making highly technical gloves for all disciplines of ice climbing, including working with some of the world's leading dry toolers, so that hopefully, maybe, potentially, there will be a better dry tooling glove in the near future. You can check them out at aniiu.com. That is ANIIU.com. As always, thanks to Hannah Noel for providing the intro music and Andrew Solomon for editing. Next week is our last of our summer session, so one more episode in this session, and then we'll be taking a few months off before we return in November. So thanks everyone for listening, and we will see you next week.